Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that have shaped and are shaping our world and inspiring the future. For all those really great stories, I'm Ira Pastor, your health, life sciences ambassador along for this journey. So, on several recent shows, we've been discussing some of the novel sort of alternative funding mechanisms that have been emerging in and around the biotechnology space, specifically related to some of the unmet medical needs that we focus on the show, specifically related to things like age tech and longevity biosciences and so forth. However, today we are going to get back to basics. We're going to get back to the street, Wall Street, that is, where the majority of the really big action and the big deals occur. I'm honored today to be joined by none other than Fred Frank. Fred is an investment banker whose name is synonymous with biotech. And for the last 50 years, he has been on Wall Street and is widely considered to be one of the first investment bankers ever to have specialized in the areas of biotech, biopharm, and healthcare services. Routinely listed as one of the top contributors to the world of biotechnology, Fred has served in a variety of roles over the years, including but not limited to vice chairmanships at Lehman Brothers, Barclays Capital, Peter J. Solomon Company. He is credited as the lead underwriter for over 125 IPOs, a negotiator in over 75 mergers and acquisitions, including the mega Bristol-Myers Squibb deal, as well as the Hoffman-LaRoche Genentech acquisition. He was around doing deals when companies like Genentech and Encetus, which eventually became part of Chiron, were tiny little startup companies. So he's really seen the evolution of this business from the very beginning. And speaking of evolution, Fred is currently the founder and chair of Evolution Life Science Partners, which is an investment bank focused on life science and healthcare companies, doing things like capital raising, M&A, and so forth, and his team has done aggregate deals in value of $125 billion. Along with his wife, Mary Tanner, who is another major force in biotech and health investment banking on Wall Street. He's also the trustee of the Tanner Frank Foundation in New York, which is involved in a variety of charitable giving activities. And Fred has received numerous awards over the years, including the Richard Bolt Senior Award, recognizing outstanding contributions to the growth and development of the chemical molecular science community, the Albert Einstein Award from the Weizmann Institute, the top 100 living contributors to biotech by Reed Elsevier, and on and on. Fred, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today and share your knowledge with us.
My pleasure.
Yeah. It's obviously there's no one in our space of biotech that doesn't know your name, but for those that listen to the show for some of the other topics, what if you just take a few minutes just to introduce yourself, give a little bit of your background in terms of where you grew up, how you got interested in banking and biotech, and sort of you can take us back to those early days when you had some of these startup business plans come across your desk for things like Genentech, talking about recombinant DNA at the time when it was sort of an unknown thing.
Well, I actually was born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1932, as was my father, who was the first in his family born in the United States. His family came from Russia, an immigrant Jewish family, and my mother's family came from Germany, and they migrated up to Portland, Oregon. So the nexus of my early life was Salt Lake City and Portland, Oregon. Through very strange circumstances, which was that my father, who was in the men's retail clothing business, subscribed to Fortune magazine, which was the leading men's fashion magazine at the time. In fact, it was a much better magazine then than now. And my father never threw them away. So in our basement, we had Fortune magazines from like 1915 all the way up. As a kid, I loved reading these. Mm-hmm. And one day I was reading the August 1932 copy, and it had an article on the Great Eastern Prep Schools. I'd never heard of a prep school. I'd never been 5 yards east of Salt Lake City. But at dinner, I asked my parents if I could go away to prep school. And they said, "What are you talking about?" And I told them about this article, and I had it with me at dinner. So my father said, "Well, I'll go visit some of the schools when I go back on a buying trip. which he did. He did the technique, it's too expensive, but he visited 5 prep schools. And one of them was the Hotchkiss School in Lakeville, Connecticut. And I applied to the various schools, and they were the first to accept me. And they said, you must let us know within 10 days. Well, what was I going to do, wait around here from the others? I didn't know one from another one. So I accepted. My parents put me on a train by myself, and off I went to Lakeville, Connecticut. That changed my life. Hotchkiss, incidentally, was started by the president of Yale University, asking Marie Hotchkiss to start a school to prepare young men for Yale in 1881.
Mm.
And the first graduating class from Hotchkiss had 36 boys. All 36 went to Yale. It was still an all-boys school when I went there. I graduated class in 1950. And out of my class of 84 boys, 42 of us went to Yale. So Fortune magazine clearly changed my life. After Yale, I was drafted in the Army during Korea and served 2 years in the Army, starting with my basic training at Fort Ord, California. Then through very strange circumstances, I was lucky and I wasn't headed west to Korea. I headed east to Paris, France, because I'd been in the Army about 7 weeks, and I was elected Soldier of the Month. Well, what do you get for that? You get your picture in the newspaper, local Fort Ord newspaper. Fort Ord is the base in California at 24,000 people, 24,000 men. You got to have lunch with the officers. You got a weekend pass, and you got a Zippo lighter with your name, rank, and serial number on one side, and the date of your award on the other. And they made a mistake. They made a mistake on the lighter. They made me a PFC, private first class. I was actually 2 ranks below that. So I said to the colonel who ran this program, sir, this is a very great honor, but I'm not a PFC. He said, well, what are you? I said, I'm an E2. He said, you're an E2? I said, yes, sir. So he calls his captain over and says, Captain, promote this man. Anybody good enough to be this should at least be a PFC. So the captain said to the colonel, I'd be pleased to do that, sir, but you forgot that rank is frozen. He said, no, I know that. Just backdate his orders to one day before rank was frozen, which they did. So I was promoted 2 ranks to PFC. And the importance of this story is that then once I was my normal assignment at Fort Ord, and I had a top secret security clearance, which meant I could pick up the mail. And one day I picked up the mail, and there was a direct assignment to SHAPE headquarters in Paris. SHAPE, you would all know today, is NATO, then called SHAPE, which stands for Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe. There were only 3 people on this base qualified for this assignment, of which I was one because they screwed up on this lighter. So I put the orders in my pocket. I was supposed to give them to the captain, but I knew he'd never let me go. So I went in to see the colonel, and he let me go. So off I went to Paris, which was a very, very nice place to do your military service.
Imagine.
At SHAPE headquarters. So from there, when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I had no idea what I wanted to do in life, except I knew I didn't want to go in my father's retail clothing business. And so I went to Stanford Business School because I figured that's what I'd figure out what I want to do, which is exactly what happened. And what I learned and liked at Stanford was all the investment areas. And so from Stanford, I went to Smith Barney and Company, and I was there for 11 years. And I went to Lehman Brothers, and that was, as Ira indicated, the beginning of my career. Now, to advance to ask his question, my boss at Smith Barney was the drug and chemical analyst, which is the way it was done in those days. So after working for Bill for a few months, I said, you know, Bill, there's no relationship between the chemical industry and the drug industry. You cover the chemical industry because you're a chemist by training. I'll cover the drug industry. And he was nice enough to let me do that. So I was Wall Street's first dedicated drug analyst. I moved on some years later, and I joined Lehman Brothers to the investment banking side and set up the first dedicated practice in life sciences, i.e. biotech, pharmaceuticals, etc. And which was very fortunate. So how I really got in the biotech side was one of the companies I knew well, which I covered, was Alza Corporation, which was started by Alex Zaffaroni, the former head of Syntex. Alza obviously stands for his name, Alexandro Zaffaroni, and he called me one day in 1976 or 1977 and asked me to come out to California to visit with a very exciting company in the biotechnology field called Cetus, which was in Berkeley, California. So I went out and I met with Alex, who was a director, and the 4 people in management, and Carl Jurassic, another extremely well-known scientist from Stanford who was on the board. And they talked to me about, they thought, they'd like to go public. And I said, well, when would you like to go public? He said, well, by year end. This was October. I said, well, the time will come, but it's not now. Now, after that, I also started covering Genentech. Genentech, in fact, was the first company to go public. It was an extraordinary offering. It was in 1980. They filed to sell 1 million shares of stock at $35 a share, which they did. And the first day it traded as high as 88. That had never happened before in Wall Street. It closed at 77. And that day I called up Cetus and said, you're going public now. So Cetus was the second company to go public. We sold a $123 million IPO, which was the second largest offering ever done at that time, the largest being Ford Motor Company. So that was my introduction to biotechnology, which I realized at the time, as I got to study and learn about the field of biotechnology, which in those days was called molecular biology, wasn't called biotech. And I realized this is a transforming part of the healthcare life science business. So I've spent many, many years since the late 1970s covering this field, which is high risk, spectacularly interesting, incredibly difficult, very promising, and leads to important discoveries for the benefit of mankind. So if you look today at the top 15 pharmaceutical companies, so-called pharmaceutical companies, half of them are biotechnology companies. Now, nobody would have believed that years ago, that we would have drugs on the market like Humira, which is the largest selling drug in the world, which is $11 billion. And so it's an amazing industry. It's very complex. It's very challenging. And what's really fascinating to me is the dedication of these people who work in it, knowing the odds of success are infinitesimally small.
Right.
Now, to give you one statistic, when you do clinical trials in order to get a drug approved, you do preclinical, then you do phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, then you apply for your approval with the FDA. Well, the failure rates from start to approval is about 97%. So think how challenging that is. If you work in this field, the chances of success are small. Now, I'll tell you a funny story, because many years ago, when biotech first started on the scene and we started having IPOs, the first slide of every presentation for a biotech company was, our objective is to be a fully integrated pharmaceutical company, i.e. a FIPCO. And many years ago, I was giving a speech, and I said to the biotech world, I said, if you want to become a FIPCO, you have to learn the sequence. You have to start off by being a JITCO, a just-in-time provider of lead compounds to big pharma. Then you'll get enough income coming in, you become a RITCO, a royalty income trust company, and then you'll have the money to become a FIPCO. And if you don't follow the sequence that I just went through, from JITCO to RITCO to FIPCO, you become a shitco. And I don't think that's what you want. I don't think that's what you want to do. So today, if you look at the biotech field and the pharmaceutical field, it's very clear that the big guys, the Novartises and the Pfizers and the Glaxos of this world, they're extremely good at development. They're extremely good at marketing. They're extremely good at manufacturing. They're not very good at research. The little guys, the biotech guys, are really good at research. They're not very good at development because they can't afford it. They're not good at marketing, and they're not good at manufacturing. So they're natural partners. So that's the evolution. Today we have a huge number of biotech companies which have been acquired by big pharma, and that will continue to be the pattern. So as these companies develop really interesting new products, and some of them are diagnostics, they're not all pharmaceuticals, you have the high probability that they will get acquired, and they get acquired at extremely high values. Now, going back to the question that I answered, in this evolution which we have today, which has led to my creating a lot of interesting M&A deals, is you get in the classic argument between biotech and big pharma who'd like to acquire, is biotech is what they consider outrageous forecasts. And the biotech company says, these aren't outrageous, these are realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And the pharma company says, you're an illusion, this is not going to happen. So what happens, we now have M&A that takes place in the form of what if.
Mm-hmm.
What if we achieve those goals? Well, we'd be happy to pay you. So what's today the typical, it's not a formula, but approach is a biotech company will be acquired by big pharma,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll be milestone based. There'll be an upfront payment. There'll be royalties on sales of products, and if they hit certain milestones for new product development, they'll get paid additional money. And the upfront payment is generally from 10 to 20% of the total which they can earn. And to give you an example, which I referred to, was clearly the most important deal that's ever been done in biotech was Genentech and Roche.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I told you about the IPO for Genentech, which was startling. But over time, the stock declined from the 70s down to $21 a share. And the chairman, who was a very well-known venture capitalist, Tom Perkins of Planet Perkins, and the CEO came to see me and said, Fred, we have a problem. We'd like to get your help. I said, well, what's the problem? They said, well, our stock is down to $21 a share. We have an incredibly exciting pipeline of new products. But if we're to develop them the way we should, our R&D costs are going to go way up, such that we will start losing substantial amounts of money. And if we do that, our stock is likely to get killed, goes down from 20 to who knows what, say 10, and somebody will take us over at exactly the wrong time. So what do we do? I said, well, let me think about it, and I'll get back to you. So I called him back a couple of days later. I said, here's what I think we should do. We should go to DuPont and get them to push their pharmaceutical business into Genentech, which would give them close to a controlling interest, and therefore you're protected.
Mm.
That followed a deal I did a number of years earlier when Marion Laboratories had a similar challenge, and I got, excuse me, and I got Dow Chemical to push their pharmaceutical division called Merrill,
Mm-hmm.
Merrill Dow,
Sure.
into Marion Labs to create Marion Merrill Dow. And that became a protective feature with additional capital for Marion. Eventually, we sold Marion Merrill Dow to Herbst to create Herbst Marion Cell.
Mm.
So it's a sequence of class. But so that's what I wanted to do with Genentech. So interestingly enough, rather amusing as I think about it, I went down to DuPont to suggest the idea that they push their pharmaceutical business into Genentech. They hired two famous investment bankers, Joe Perella and Bruce Wasserstein from First Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And I got down there, and Bruce said, Fred, we recommended our client not do this. I said to myself, well, why'd you ask me to come to work? You could have told me that on the phone. But it was from the DuPont hotel where we were having a meeting that I called Roche. I set up a meeting. I went over to see them. I explained the situation to them. They were very excited to think that they could get into the biotech field through the acquisition of the leading company, Genentech. So I negotiated, I went back and forth to Basel, and eventually Genentech agreed to the deal. I went back to Basel to dot some I's and cross some T's, and Henry Meyer, the brilliant CFO, a very interesting guy, said, as I explained it, because it had a CVR, which we also had in Marion Merrill Dow, which I'll tell you in a minute, said, well, Fred, we can't do that deal. Said, Henry, you already agreed to the deal, and Genentech's board has approved it. Well, to make a long story short, I renegotiated the deal. This was actually at the Bilder Grand Hotel in Zurich, and I went back to Genentech in California and said, well, guys, there's a slight change here. And actually, it was a much better deal. And the deal was agreed upon, and the deal was done. And the importance of that deal was that Roche recognized that the most valuable asset at Genentech was not their products, was not their science, was their people. So the way it was set up was Roche bought 10% of the company at the market, $21 a share, and simultaneously they tendered to acquire 50% of the shares from the shareholders at a very big premium, $36 a share, 67% premium. So pro forma, they own 60% of the company. And Henry Meyer was a really smart guy, as was the CEO, as was the chairman CEO. And so when we went to dot all the I's and cross the T's at the law firm, Wachtell Lipton, Henry walks into the room, and there were about 20 people in the room, bankers, lawyers, etc. And Henry was a very shy guy. He said, Fred, who are all these people? I said, Henry, they're mostly your lawyers. He said, come, let's go have a conversation. So I asked the group to please be patient, that Dr. Myers would like to have a meeting with me. So we went in, and Henry said, well, Fred, we've already agreed upon the deal. Well, what's the issue? I said, Henry, there are a lot of small things we haven't even talked about. He said, well, like what? I said, like the board of directors. You own 60% of the company. How many people are you going to put on the board? He said, one. I said, no, Henry, you're going to put on two. He said, well, why do I want to do that? I said, because you're going to put on a scientist, and you can put on a business person. He said, okay, that makes sense. And we went through a number of issues. We go back in the room, and I explained to the people there, thank you for your patience. Dr. Meyer and I have talked about a number of issues. I will repeat them, and we're asking counsel for both sides, please taper this the way I explained it. Don't try to improve it for your client. Well, the lawyers, of course, didn't like that, but it's the way it was. So when I came to this issue of board of directors, I went through and said, Dr. Myers agreed that Roche will put two people on the board. This young banker for Roche jumps up and says, Dr. Meyer, you're goddamn crazy. Well, Henry may be a lot of things, but crazy was not one of them. So Henry looks at this young kid, and he just melts back into his chair. It was really quite a moment. Anyway, the deal was done. It was extremely successful. What it had is that Roche had the right to buy the 40% they didn't own over the next 5 years. The prices escalated quarterly, ending at the end of the fifth year at $60 a share. As we got close to the end period of 5 years, I went to Genentech, and the stock at that time was selling around 57, the exercise price being 60. And I said to the board at Genentech, I said, I don't have any facts, but I don't think they're going to exercise their right when it comes due. They said, well, why not? I said, well, look at your own forecast, which incidentally were public in the proxy statement. That you haven't come anywhere near achieving your forecast. And they said, well, Fred, what do you think we should do? I said, I think we should renegotiate. They said, well, how do we do that? I said, look, they don't have any rights. All they do is own stock. Let's be realistic. You're never going to have the marketing capability that they have outside the United States. So let's give them marketing rights, ex-USA, for consideration of extending the deal. So make a long story short, we extended it for 3 years from 60 to an exercise price of 90, and I got them to agree that if they didn't exercise their option, the shareholders had the right to put it at $60 a share. But when we announced it, typical Wall Street, they said, this is the dumbest effing deal I've ever seen. Why would Roche ever acquire it at 90? They don't do anything. The shareholders will put it to them at 60. And for those of you who remember the Lone Ranger, I said, not so fast, Tonto. Let's assume at the end of the period, the stock is selling. I'm sorry, I said 90. That was incorrect. It's 86.5. Let's assume the stock is selling at 77. Do you think the shareholders are going to put it to at 60 with the stock at 70? I don't think so. So anyway, to make a long story short, they exercised their call option to acquire the rest of the company. And a few months later, they took it public again at 95 because they realized, again, having Genentech independent, as it is today, the same way,
Right.
It would benefit Roche much more than taking control and losing all the brain power. So it's a very interesting deal. It stood the test of time, and I did a number of other deals like that. And what it does show you is in the biotech world, in the pharma world, it really requires a lot of architectural engineering to do a lot of deals. I mean, I've done very complex deals with Lilly, a company called Advanced Cardiovascular System. We got in the classic pissing contest. They didn't believe the figures. And so I negotiated a deal that had a very interesting structure for ACS to get more money if they achieve certain results, which in fact they did. So this is an industry that requires a lot of what I think is architecture in order to get a lot of deals done. Now, at the time we're in right now, that's not true because Biotech gets acquired at very handsome prices. Most of them are earnouts. They get a certain upfront payment, and then they get more money over time. But it doesn't require any really clever engineering the way we did in the early days. So that's kind of the history.
No, that's wonderful, and you're leading me into another question in terms of the few times I had a chance to sit at a conference room table with you in the past and sort of drink in your knowledge. You were very fond of sort of this chart. I remember it was about 15 years ago or so, which basically, it basically highlighted sort of when you have some of these companies that have whatever, they're 20, they're 30, they're $40 billion in revenue, and they're promising Wall Street a certain amount of growth. That there was a specific level of blockbusters that were required on an annual basis to replace all the stuff that was expiring. And, at the time, the big names were, Lipitor and Viagra and Celebrex and drugs like that. Now, looking at the top 10 blockbusters, as you were saying, you got Humira there, but then you got a bunch of these immuno-oncology products. They make a lot of money. I don't know if they're definitely blockbusters from a monetary perspective. Are we still in that, here we are in the era of, I guess 40 and 50 and $60 billion pharmaceutical giants. Do you see still these same patterns, Fred? Are we still having these issues that, they require a certain diet of blockbusters every year when in this era of more personalized medicine? Where are we going with all that, in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I gave a speech years ago which I showed a table, which is what maybe you're referring to.
Yeah.
Which I took the top pharmaceutical companies. I said, look, let me show you why they're all going to be failures. And there was gas in the audience. I said, well, let me define failure. They're not going to achieve their objectives. And I said, let's assume their objectives, which was conservative, is 10% revenue and earnings growth over the next 5 years. I will show you that none of the top pharmaceutical companies can possibly achieve that. And I gave the financial information to show that. So I said, therefore, the natural way to overcome this is to do deals with biotech companies. And in fact, is none of the large companies, the Pfizers and the Mercks and this world, have achieved the kind of growth that they thought they would achieve. And partially, as you said, Ira, because you have these blockbuster expirations. So if you have a product doing $5 or $6 billion and it goes off patents, within the first 18 months, it's going to lose 80% of the volume. Well, you can't replace $4 billion in lost revenues very quickly,
Right.
because research just isn't that effective. So that led me to encourage these guys to recognize what I said earlier, is the biotech companies are good at R and you guys are good at D. So you're natural partners. So figure out how to partner in one form or another, acquisitions or joint venture, whatever it is, with biotech, so you have the fodder in your pipelines to offset these huge blockbuster explorations. And so that's what we've been doing over the last years. If you look at the number of biotech acquisitions by pharmas, it's an amazing number.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're talking about approaching 100.
It's phenomenal.
And that will continue, because the other part of that equation is the biotech companies are funded by venture capital.
Right.
Well, venture capitalists, their entry strategy is an exit strategy.
Right.
They're putting in money in order to get a return. Well, they're not like the pharma companies who can take a 20-year outlook. They have limited time life in their funds, so they want to monetize that, and they don't want to monetize it by issuing shares to their shareholders, which are privately held biotech companies. So this is part of the equation that leaves the dynamics between big pharma and biotech.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to continue. There's just no question about it.
Excellent.
And it's very exciting and very challenging.
What is your opinion on this phenomena that we see in the venture capital industry nowadays, surrounding what's referred to as a unicorn? So these privately held startups that the venture capitalists value at over $1 billion. There's this super unicorn definition where you get the Facebooks and the Ubers and things like that, but you begin to see some of it sort of spill into biotech. I think Moderna is the one that's usually mentioned, but there's one in my space in the sort of the anti-aging world called Samumed, which recently decided they were worth $12 billion after their recent venture capital round. Is this unicorn phenomena real in your opinion? And then ultimately, if it is, sort of, how does that impact sort of the FIPCO dynamic, in the sense that if you do have these types of valuations, can you get some people or some of the companies that go outside of the sequence, as you say?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Now, Moderna is actually not a very good example, because it has a very broad and very deep portfolio of products, although it does have a very elevated value. It has the wherewithal behind it to become a very successful company. But you're right, a lot of these unicorn companies, which are one product companies, which command a huge valuation, that's very high risk. And there are many examples over the last few years of biotech companies which had very high valuations, where they failed in clinical trials in phase 2 or phase 3, and the stocks went to the, a speech I gave years ago, I said, the risk is these stocks will go to the square root of their IPO prices. Well, I was wrong. It turns out to be the cube root. But so it's very high risk, and Wall Street investors get carried away on the potential, because they look at a product as, well, if this can cure a certain form of cancer, it's going to be worth $1 zillion. But that two-letter word, if, is a very big word.
Mm.
And for example, this week alone, both Roche and Lilly announced substantial failures in phase 3 trials, and obviously the stocks got, they're big companies, so it wasn't that big, but the stocks got knocked down,
Mm-hmm.
and the products failed. So now those products are gone, having spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the research of those products. But that's just the way the industry is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about venture capital nowadays? I mean, back in the 10, 15 years ago, you seem to have a much wider spread, let's say, of seed funds and early stage funds and sort of the crossover funds and so forth. Today, it seems like the so-called valley of death type investors are less in the sense that a lot of these funds have transitioned to be closer to the clinical, the proof of principle clinical stuff, and we have maybe less going on in the earlier stage. Is this still the pattern? And is there potentially any relief for the valley of death, or is it just something that we have to deal with moving
No,
forward?
I think this will just continue on. But one of the things, of course, which has happened over the years is we have a number of biotech venture funds run by really capable people. They've been at it many years, like OrbitMed and Deerfield,
Right.
and they're really talented, knowledgeable people, and they've had actually very good records. And but that's not a huge part of the industry. So the risk component of this industry will be, and I think always will be, very, very high risk. The body is a very complicated mechanism.
Right.
And as much progress as we've made, as much as we've learned, there's a huge amount we don't know.
Yep.
So the case I mentioned earlier of the failure of Lilly and Roche in doing some products for Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
I mean, we have no products for Alzheimer's, and there's probably been, I'm just making up the number because I haven't done the research, but there's probably been $5 billion of research spent on trying to find a product for Alzheimer's. And it's very complicated.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of been the valley of death for a lot of research. And hopefully someday we'll find an answer, and I'm sure we will.
Mm-hmm.
But it's probably not tomorrow.
In the range, I mean, obviously you see a wide range of deals in all sorts of different therapeutic classes, and one of the areas that I sort of hang out in. I mean, my day job's in regenerative medicine, but then sort of there's a subset of that space, what we'll call longevity biotech, which is basically a group of companies that's trying to sort of work upstream from disease, sort of the basic processes of aging, as opposed to the diseases that sort of float from aging. Obviously there was the Sertris Glaxo deal that was done several years ago, which didn't turn out very well. There's been a few IPOs in recent years, Restor Bio and Unity Biotech, which went public, I think, last year. And the question is, so are you seeing any activity in your own deal flow in terms of this topic of aging as a target, as opposed to sort of the downstream diseases of aging? Is there much? What's Wall Street, I guess, currently sort of thinking about in terms of this topic? If you do see these types of deals.
No, it's a very current topic, and Ira, you're right to bring it up, because aging is obviously something that none of us can do anything about. Except I'll tell you a funny story. My dear wife gave me a surprise birthday party at my 60th birthday, which is a long time ago, and she got me where she wanted me to be, and there were all these people there, including David Jones, the head of Humana, who was the one who got me. He called me up and said, "Fred, look, I'm coming from Louisville to New York. It's very urgent that I see you on this date." I looked at my calendar. I said to David, "Can we do it the day before or the day after?" He said, "No, Fred, trust me. We've known each other a long time. This is more important than any deal you're working on." So I felt, I had a big merger, right? So I reorganized my calendar. I went to where I was supposed to be, and it was a surprise birthday party. Well, people got up and told these whopping lies about how great I was. And David said, "Well, Fred, get up and say something." So I got up. I said, "Well, look, I'm delighted to be here with some of our clients, with some of my family, some of my coworkers, but you're all in a misunderstanding. I'm not 60 years old." And there was silence in this room. I had to screw up on something as easy as a birthday, particularly my wife is there. I said, "Look, we have a lot of wonderful clients like Humana here. When Humana does very well and their stocks get to be $60 a share, they declare a 2-for-1 split." I said, "I declared a 2-for-1 split, so I'm only 30 years old." But as long as we're all having a nice dinner together, let's have some fun. But what you're saying is really true. aging is a very complicated aspect. And people have told me over the years, they said, I'm now 88, they said, Fred, for a man of your age, you're in pretty good shape. I said, yeah, I am. I said, well, you must have the secret of good health. You're in the health industry. I said, yeah, I do. They said, well, would you share it with us? I said, certainly, but there's not one secret to good health. There's three secrets. And the first secret is wash your hands frequently. And that's really true. That's really true today with what's going on. The second is get a lot of sleep, which I don't do. And the third, and by far the most important, is pick your parents very carefully.
Yep. Yep.
So those are the secrets of good health. But it's a very complicated field, very complicated research on figuring out drugs, be they biotech drugs or chemical drugs, how to make them effective, because a lot of drugs which are found to be effective that have been discovered over the years by pharma are very toxic.
Yeah.
So the drug is as bad as the disease. So it is a very challenging, and I give incredible credit to the people who work on this field. They're dedicated. It's not a question of what their salaries are or what their bonuses are going to be. They're driven people who want to make a difference and increasing the quality and longevity of life. And what could be better than that? That's why I've always been thrilled to work in the industry. Because at Lehman Brothers, one of our absolutely most important accounts was Philip Morris. And I said to myself, I could never work at Philip Morris. How do you go to work every day selling cancer? How do you do that? I said, well, at least in what I'm doing in life sciences, you really feel good about what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah, and you're not going to be successful all the time, but the motivation is there, and the increasing the knowledge base so that we can have better and more effective drugs is what's going on. It's an exciting field.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Before I let you go, and I have a lot of things to do, I just wanted to throw one other question at you. Occasionally over the years, I'll see something about an interesting model, a financial model or so. A couple of years ago, I sent you one about this MIT professor, Andrew Lo, who has these ideas for sort of mega funds, where, you raise tens of billions of dollars to focus on certain diseases and hence try to eliminate the risks of the smaller sort of pools of companies. Obviously, there's been a lot going on the last few years in terms of crowdfunding and crypto and all this. Are there any interesting models that, aside from sort of your traditional stuff that you look at in terms of the VC to the private equity into the public markets, anything that you see on the horizon that you say to yourself, well, wow, that might be something interesting that will added another dimension to Wall Street, or are some of these things just sort of fly by night and we're not going to hear about them anymore?
I don't know. I don't really see anything new in terms of creative ideas on how to fund the life sciences field, or how to do deals between biotech and pharma, or get other companies interested, non-pharmaceutical companies interested in the life sciences field. I mean, it's pretty well established right now. I mean, we've had all kinds of creative deals. I look over the years of, the kind of problems I've had to solve to make deals happen. Because I said you always get into the classic proverbial pissing contest. The company thinks it's worth X, and the potential buyer says, you're out of your mind. So you have to figure out how to bridge that. So it does take creative architecture, and it's kind of on a one-off kind of a deal. You have to look at each individual situation to kind of figure it out.
Well, I appreciate that, Fred. It's really been, as I said, an honor having you join us today to talk about your experience, in the way you've sort of led this industry for the last several decades, and really taking these early stage ideas and getting them to market. And I just really want to thank you for what you've done in building the industry, but also in coming on the show today. It's really been a great honor talking to you again. It's always a great honor talking to you.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.